Hello and welcome to this slideshow of our trip to Israel. Coming up there are a few hundred photos with a few short videos mixed in. This was a 7-day coach tour. We had a very knowledgeable guide who took us to lots of different places and he gave us lots of information. Although I think I've forgot most of it by now, but I did take some notes. The places we went to are mostly historical, and most of those were related to the Bible. So buckle up, here we go. Our trip began in Tel Aviv, a modern city on the coast at the Mediterranean Sea. Our hotel was right next to the sea, so the first evening we walked down to the seafront and took a few photos. Nice view of the beach. It was a very pleasant evening, though it looks a little bit rough there. In the background you can see the old city of Jaffa. So day 2 started with the short trip to Jaffa, or Joppa as it's known in the Bible. This is the port where Jonah made his escape to Tarshish, and the port where the timber for the Jewish temples came in from Lebanon. All very narrow streets. This is a giant bendy spoon outside the Uri Geller Museum. It weighs 11 tons. And Uri Geller was born in Tel Aviv. This building belonged to Simon the Tanner and is the place where the Apostle Peter used to stay. It was here that Peter raised Tabitha from the dead and also had his famous vision in which he was asked to eat animals regarded as unclean in Jewish tradition. That was Acts chapter 10 verse 15. And this is the old port at Jaffa. And this is a view of the modern city of Tel Aviv. Our hotel is in there somewhere. So leaving Jaffa, we made our journey north to the ancient city of Caesarea. This city and port was created by Herod the Great in honor of the Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar. It took around 12 years to build and was completed around 10 BC. This is the theatre, and this is a plaque showing what it probably looked like. This is a replica of a rock that was excavated in the 1960s. It is inscribed with the words Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea. And this is the only archaeological evidence that mentions the name of Pilate. St. Paul was also imprisoned here for 2 years. This is the hippodrome where chariot racing would have taken place. This is just inside the entrance to the hippodrome. In the background you can see some seats, and in the foreground is a toilet. No ladies and gents in those days, you just went to the toilet in front of a few thousand people. From Caesarea we went across to Nazareth. This is the Church of the Annunciation where Mary lived, and the angel Gabriel appeared to her announcing that she would give birth to Jesus. There are mosaics on the inner wall that surround the church. Each mosaic is from a different country, and this is the Irish one. I think it says, Mother of God, loving Mother and ruler of the world, maybe. Pray for the people of Ireland. This is the inside of the church, and there is a small crypt or grotto which is lit up in the centre. To either side of it you can see the remains of the excavations of previous churches that were on this site. At the time of the Roman Empire, Christianity was made legal in 312 AD, so around 326 AD, St. Helena, who was the mother of Roman Emperor Constantine, had a job of locating the various religious and Christian places in the Holy Land. It seems that previous Roman emperors had built pagan temples on these places to hide them, but this in fact made the locations easier to identify. So there have been 4 churches on this site since around 400 AD. This is the view from the opposite side. On the bottom right is where the people are queuing to visit the grotto. This is a view of the ceiling. And here we are at the grotto. This is supposed to be where Mary's house was located, and the stairs in the background are part of the original church from 400 AD. Upstairs is the traditional church where services are held. So we're back outside now. That's the church to the left, with the main gates in the center of the picture. Next to the church are more excavations showing pathways and ruins from around the time of Jesus. Just about 100 meters up the hill is St. Joseph's Church. A bit more traditional. It was built in 1914. Again, excavations under the church show what is known as the carpentry shop of Joseph. So it looks like Mary and Joseph were neighbours. The plaque on the wall says that the nearby caves, granaries and wells were used by the early dwellers of Nazareth. Travellers who visited the place in the 7th century pointed out that this had been the location of the carpentry shop of Joseph, and later traditions identified the place as being the house of Joseph. So back down the hill for lunch and souvenirs. This is a shot from the coach. I tried to capture the size of the city of Nazareth. It was originally a village on the side of a hill, but now it covers the whole valley, and indeed it spills right over the top of the hills. So we travelled east to the town of Tiberias, on the bank of the Sea of Galilee, where we stayed for 2 nights. Our hotel was on the outskirts of the town. These are date palms, by the way, producing dates and not coconuts. We went out that evening for a walk and had a little paddle in the sea. On day 3 we travelled to the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, and our first stop was at the Mount of Beatitudes, where the Sermon on the Mount took place. We had a reading from Matthew chapter 5 and then walked up to the Church of the Beatitudes on top of the mount. This was built in 1938. As usual, an older church was built on this site dating from the 4th century. Inside is just a shrine. It's octagonal inside, and each of the walls have words of the 8 Beatitudes. The case next to the door contains a cloak donated by Pope John Paul II in the year 2000. So back outside, this is a view over the Sea of Galilee. Back on the road again, we travelled just a few kilometres to Tabgha, which is where the feeding of the multitude took place. This is called the Church of the Multiplication. Under the altar is a limestone rock that was found during excavations, which is supposed to be the stone where the miracle took place. Mosaics on the floor with images of loaves and fishes. Back on the coach and another short trip to the city of Capernaum. This is the city of Jesus, as in Matthew chapter 4 verse 12 and Matthew chapter 9 verse 1. Jesus chose 5 apostles here. He performed many miracles here, like healing the paralyzed man lowered through the roof of Peter's house and healing Peter's mother-in-law. This is the synagogue where Jesus would have preached. Well, this is a 4th century synagogue, but it's built on the original synagogue of Capernaum. People would have sat on the benches on each side while the scriptures are being read at the front. A lot of excavations went on here. There is a millstone, for example, for crushing fruit or seeds. Some ancient stone carvings showing the Star of David, and another that looks like the Ark of the Covenant. These are the walls of the houses in the old city. The modern structure is actually a church built on top of the house that Peter lived in. There is the front entrance, and this is a view of Peter's house underneath the church. And there's a statue of St. Peter. The inscription below says, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." Just a few yards away is the shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was here that Jesus chose the fishermen, Peter, Andrew, James and John, to join him, and also Matthew, the tax collector who lived in Capernaum. From here we travelled a few miles south to the town of Magdala, also on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. This is likely to have been the birthplace of Mary Magdalene. There are excavations going on here, but the purpose of our visit was for lunch. Most people photograph their food nowadays, so this is our lunch: St. Peter's fish, or tilapia as it's known. It tasted a lot better than it looked. After that we visited a modern kibbutz and the Galilee Museum. The remains of an ancient boat was discovered on the seabed, and the timbers were dated to be from the time of Jesus. Just behind the museum there's a little jetty, so we had a little boat ride out onto the sea. Day 4 started with rain. We travelled back towards Nazareth to the town of Cana and the Franciscan Wedding Church. As always, there are remains of houses in the basement of the church dating back to the 1st century. There is also on display an original pot made of stone that would have been used to store water. More stones and pots with inscriptions on display here. Obviously it's a working church as well. And this is one of the local tourist shops where you can buy souvenirs, like Cana wine for example. Onwards we went, and not far from Cana and Nazareth is the Tzipori National Park, site of a Roman city built in the 1st century BC. Two of the main sites in the city are the theatre and the lookout tower, both shown in this photo. A closer look at the theatre, which would have seated over 4,000 people. Heading up to the tower at the top of the hill, there are cactuses along the road. Looks dangerous, wouldn't like to get too close. The lookout tower was built in the 12th century on top of a previous structure. This is a corner of the tower. The stone with the holes in is actually a sarcophagus. The stone above it is from the time of King Herod. He was known for the 2-inch margin chiseled around the edges. There are a lot more stones of this style in Jerusalem. Great views from the top of the tower. The hills in the background is all Nazareth. We had a video presentation in the ancient synagogue. Some of the titles below are from Psalm 121, which we learned at school. The floor of the synagogue was covered in various mosaics. The one in the photo is the two servants of Abraham with their donkey, while Abraham went off with Isaac for the sacrifice. Back outside, this is the main part of the Roman city. All Roman towns had two main streets running north-south and east-west. This one is called the Decumanus, which runs east-west. The paving is laid at 45 degrees to stop cartwheels getting stuck between the gaps in the slabs. All the main buildings would be next to these main streets, and the residential streets would be further out from the centre. One of the main things to see in Zipori is the mosaics. So we left Zipori and started our journey southeast to the ruins of another Roman town called Beit Shean. On the way we passed Mount Tabor, which is where the transfiguration of Jesus took place. We didn't go, but apparently there's a church and a monastery on top of the mountain. This is Beit Shean. People were living here about 6,000 years ago, and in Roman times it may have been home to 30 or 40,000 people. It's mentioned in the Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 31. When King Saul died, the Philistines put his body on the walls of Beit Shean. This is a model of this city. The original city would have been on top of the hill, but the Romans decided to rebuild it at the foot of the hill. This is the Roman theatre, big enough for 7,000 people, and it was over 20 meters tall. This is part of the Roman bathhouse and sauna. The floor would rest on these pillars, and hot air would have been pumped from a fire outside under the floor to heat the water. This was at the main street through the town centre. Up the steps is a pavement with a mosaic floor, and along that pavement would have been a row of shops. As you can see, the outline of each shop, where there's a couple of rows of blocks. Yeah, it looks a bit of a mess, but the city was destroyed by an earthquake in 749 AD. Not much left. You can barely make out where the houses and buildings were. So we completed the circle and we're back now at the theatre. This is the side door onto the stage, and this is a view from the stage. This was a notice near the theatre about public toilets. According to this, people entered into a public courtyard paved with a mosaic floor and lined along the walls with toilets. No separation and no evidence of a division between men and women's facilities. A channel of running water beneath the seats provided drainage, and personal hygiene was achieved by a leaf attached to a twig. So that was the end of our visit to northern Israel. From there we headed over 100 kilometers south through the West Bank to Jerusalem. On our side of the coach, we are looking over the River Jordan and the country of Jordan on the other side. You might notice the West Bank fence, which was built to guard against terrorism. The Israeli settlements on the other side of the road all have security fences around. On our way we also passed by Jericho, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It was built around 9,000 years BC, and it's also the lowest city in the world at an altitude of 258 meters below sea level. Some photos of the Judean desert. So day 5, a very early start. We were at the Dung Gate in the old city of Jerusalem at just after 7 AM. The purpose was to visit the Dome of the Rock as it gets very busy later in the day. Right, before we go on, quick history lesson on the walls of Jerusalem. The original city was built by the Jebusites during the Bronze Age. It was built on a ridge so that it could be easier to protect from invaders. However, David captured the city around 1004 BC, 2 Samuel chapter 5, and built stronger walls around it. His son Solomon built the first temple on Mount Moriah and extended the city walls to enclose the temple. About 250 years later, the population of Jerusalem had grown, so Hezekiah built a broad wall around the larger city to protect against the Assyrians. 2 Chronicles 32 verse 5. In 586 BC, the Babylonians came and destroyed the city, but Nehemiah returned and rebuilt the city, but only to the size of the original city that Solomon had built. Nehemiah chapter 6. By 63 BC, the city had grown again, and the walls that Hezekiah had built were rebuilt. In 19 BC, King Herod decided to refurbish the temple and build up the sides of the mount with large retaining walls. Herod's grandson Agrippa extended the walls of the city outward in 66 AD, but 4 years later the walls and the temple were destroyed by the Romans. 200 years later, Emperor Hadrian rebuilt the walls again, but they were destroyed again in 1033 by an earthquake. They were rebuilt again, but excluded a large area at the south and southeast, which included Mount Zion and the city of David. The last rebuild was completed in 1530 by the Ottoman Empire, and these are the walls visible today. So the point of all this is to show that the famous Western Wall is not part of the old temple, as a lot of people seem to think, but it's part of a retaining wall that surrounded the temple. So this is just inside the walls of the old city. It's a view of the sunrise over the Mount of Olives. And this is the Western Wall on the right. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. Directly opposite the mosque is the Dome of the Rock. The rock refers to the rock on which Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac on Mount Moriah. The rock is also known as the foundation stone and is believed to be the place from which the rest of the world was created. In other words, the first bit of the world to come into being. Nice view of the Mount of Olives. From there we go back down the hill via the streets of the old city and out onto the plaza with a view of the sunrise over the western wall. Back on the coach, we then went to the Israel Museum. The two things we came to see here were the Dead Sea Scrolls and the model of Jerusalem, showing how it would have looked at the time of the Second Temple, or around 66 AD. The model takes up about half an acre. This is a view from the south where we can see the temple on the right and the city of David stretching down below it. Right in the center of the picture is a huge theater that King Herod built. There is a closer look at the city of David. This is a view from the southwest. In the foreground is Herod's palace. This is the view from the west side. Right in the center of the picture you can see a gate in the wall, and just outside the gate is a little rocky mound. This is Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. A view from the north, mostly residential. And this is the view from the east, and a couple of close-ups of the temple. The other part of the museum was the Shrine of the Book, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls are kept. That part of the museum is underground, and the building in the photo is designed to represent the lid of one of the pots in which the scrolls were found. Down the steps, this is the entrance. No photography allowed inside, so can't show any pictures. We only went in the section with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there are lots more to see in this museum. For example, there's an ankle bone with a nail in it, showing that crucifixion was something practiced by the Romans. After that we went to the main market in Jerusalem. Most of this is indoor on narrow streets. Lots of noise, lots of smells of various spices and cooking and so on. This is a bar, lots of beers to choose from, and I think one's got my name on it. This is the back of a restaurant. We were shown how the food was prepared in a traditional way. Oh yeah, we had lunch in the market. Next stop was the Holocaust Memorial Museum on the western side of modern Jerusalem. This is the open area by the entrance, Again, you have to go underground to the actual museum. The sculptures in the distance commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. These are the close-ups. So anyone who helped the Jews during the war has a tree planted here in their honor. And here is a tree for Oskar Schindler. Again, no photography allowed inside, but it seems intentionally dark and stuffy in there. But by the time you get out, it's nice to get back out into the fresh air. This is the main entrance. The quote on the wall is from Ezekiel 37, verse 14. I will put my breath into you, and you shall live again, and I will set you upon your own soil. We then headed off to Bethlehem, which is only about 6 miles south of Jerusalem. This is in an Area A zone administered by the Palestinian Authority, so we had to swap our Jewish guide for a Muslim guide. This is the Church of the Nativity, which was originally built around 330 AD by St. Helena. We're told it's more likely that the Nativity took place in a small cave that was used to house animals. So this is the front door of the church. It's just 1.2 meters high. If you look above the door, there are several arches showing that the door was previously much larger. There are two reasons that the door is now so small, one being that conquerors could not enter the church on horseback, and the other is that every visitor should bow before stepping inside the church. Inside the door is the Basilica of the Nativity. Mosaics on the wall. This is the chancel at the front, a lot of lamps hanging down. The grotto of the Nativity, where Jesus was born, is underneath the altar. This is the doorway leading down, just under the light. Not much space down there. And this silver 14-point star on the marble floor marks the traditional site of the birth of Jesus. The 14 points represent the three groups of 14 ancestors of Jesus, going back through Jeconiah and David to Abraham.
여기 보세요. 자, 여기 보세요, 여기. 나오시고. 빨리 찍으세요. 이제 나오세요. 저쪽으로, 저 뒤로 많이.
This is the exit door from the grotto. Outside again, and this is the Catholic Church of St. Catherine that has joined onto the Church of the Nativity. This is the parish church for Catholics living in Bethlehem. Midnight Mass is celebrated here on Christmas Eve, so it gets quite busy around that time. This is a sculpture, The Call of David, where Samuel meets Jesse and his sons. 1 Samuel chapter 16. David is on the right with his sheep and goats. The tree represents the genealogy of Jesus. And this is a photo showing Pope Benedict blessing the artwork in 2009. There are lots more passages and caves and mini chapels underneath St. Catherine's Church. One is St. Joseph's Chapel, where he and Mary stayed when Jesus was a baby. Also the cave of St. Jerome, who translated the scriptures from Hebrew and Greek into Latin. Outside in the courtyard is a statue of St. Jerome. And we're back out on the main square again. One final photo of Bethlehem, and as you can see we are in what was known as the hill country of Judea. Day 6 was mostly around Jerusalem, and we started on top of the Mount of Olives. The mount itself is a ridge with 3 peaks and gives nice views back over Jerusalem. Here you can see the Dome of the Rock and the old city wall heading south. This is a view down the Kidron Valley, and on the extreme left, where there's a clump of trees, is the Garden of Gethsemane. Here, right in the center of the picture, you can see the north part of the old city wall. From there we went back down to the old city. This photo was taken out the window of the coach. The big church in the middle is called the Church of All Nations. It got this name because 12 countries donated to the cost of having it built. Right next to the church on the left is the Garden of Gethsemane, where there are olive trees that are over 2,200 years old. Inside the church is a rock which Jesus prayed at before he was arrested. Mark 14 verses 32 to 42. The church just above it and to the right, the one with the gold top, is the Church of Mary Magdalene, which is a Russian Orthodox church. This is a view of the old city wall near the Dung Gate. In the background is the Jewish cemetery on the Mount of Olives, where up to 150,000 people have been buried over the last 3,000 years. The notes from the western wall are also buried on the Mount of Olives, as they cannot be burned because they contain God's name. This is a view in the same direction, but we are on the inside of the old city wall, with the southern wall of the Temple Mount on the left. Again, a similar view. On top of the Mount of Olives is the Church of the Ascension, which is a Russian Orthodox church. This is the corner of the Temple Mount. On the right is the southern wall, on the left is the western wall. And this is a close-up of the corner. As you can see, the blocks have the 2-inch margin, which is a design used by King Herod. Some of the cornerstones are over 30 feet long and weigh around 50 tons. The Herodian stones only go up about 7 to 10 rows, meaning that the Romans couldn't move the larger stones when they destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. At the time of the Second Temple, this was the main street that ran through Jerusalem for about 1 kilometer. There would have been a bridge to get you up to the temple, and this is an artist's impression of how it would have looked. This is a ritual bath where people would clean themselves before going up to the temple. From there we made our way through some street markets to the Lions Gate Street, near the eastern wall just north of the Temple Mount. This is the gateway into the Church of St. Anne, who was the mother of St. Mary. Anne and her husband Joachim lived here, so it is presumed that Mary was born here. The original church was built in 450 AD. Back outside, next to the church, is a partially excavated area believed to be the pools of Bethesda. This is where Jesus healed the paralyzed man, St. John chapter 5, verses 5 to 9. This was one of only 2 miracles that Jesus performed in Jerusalem. The other was healing the blind man, St. John chapter 9. Our guide mentioned that when David first captured the city of Jerusalem, David also had to deal with the lame and the blind, as in 2 Samuel chapter 5. So out on the street again, we begin what is called the Stations of the Cross. This is apparently the route that Jesus would have taken on the day he was crucified, and there are 14 stations along this route which mark different events of that day. Just outside St. Anne's Church there are 14 plaques on the wall that show the stations. This is a map of the route. This is an arch that's located where Pilate's Roman fortress used to be. The street name is Via Dolorosa, which means the way of sorrow. Under the arch is an entrance into a courtyard that has 2 churches. The first is the Chapel of Condemnation, which is the first station and marks the place where Jesus was condemned to death. Just across the way is the Church of Flagellation, which is the second station where Jesus received the cross. Further down the street we stopped for a quick lunch in the restaurant on the left. Just opposite the restaurant is the third station, which is where Jesus fell for the first time. Right next to that is the fourth station where he met his mother. Turning the corner and starting uphill again is the fifth station where Simon of Cyrene helped Jesus to carry the cross. Also at this corner is the spot where Jesus put his hand on the wall to steady himself. Station 6 is where St. Veronica wipes his face. Continuing uphill is Station 7, where Jesus fell for a second time. At this point he goes through the gate and is now outside the old city wall. Station 8 is where Jesus speaks to the daughters of Jerusalem. Luke chapter 23 verse 28. Jesus fell again for the third time at Station 9. Station 10 at the top of the hill is where Jesus was stripped of his garments. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which houses the places where Jesus died and was resurrected. Ownership of the church is shared between Greek Orthodox, Catholics and Armenian Orthodox. There are around 30 individual chapels inside the church. The original church was built by Emperor Constantine in 335 AD and replaced a Roman temple. On the site of the church, St. Helena found the remains of wooden crosses, one of which was able to cure diseases, and underneath that was a rock-cut tomb. Just inside the church entrance is a stairway that leads up to Calvary. On the walls and ceiling are paintings and mosaics. This one is the binding of Isaac. Just above their heads and slightly out of the picture is King David holding a scroll with the words, "They have pierced my hands and my feet," from Psalm 22.
Imagine the place before the church was built. Before there was here a shrine to God. This is where Jesus.
Next to that is the 11th station, where Jesus is nailed to the cross. This is a statue of the Virgin Mary with a dagger placed to wound her heart, as mentioned by Simeon in Luke chapter 2, verses 34 and 35. Station 12 is where Jesus dies on the cross. Underneath the altar at the bottom of the photo is a hole where you can touch the rock of Calvary. This area of the church belongs to the Greek Orthodox. Station 13 is in the same location and is where the body of Jesus is taken from the cross. Back downstairs, this is a view of the ceiling. And just opposite the main entrance is the Stone of Anointing. This is the place where the body of Jesus was laid and prepared for burial. Just touching the stone, you can smell the anointing oil on your hand, and the rock is said to have healing properties. This is now in the rotunda, which is the area under the largest dome of the church. In the center, at the bottom of the picture, is the edicule, which is a small building divided into two chapels. The first chapel contains a fragment of the stone that sealed the tomb of Christ. The second is the tomb itself and marks the 14th and final station of the cross, where Jesus is laid in the Holy Sepulchre. Due to the very large queue, we didn't go in, and apparently photography is not allowed inside. This is another chapel inside the church. It is the Armenian chapel dedicated to St. Helena. The mosaic on the floor just past the railing shows Noah's Ark on top of Mount Ararat, which is a holy mountain in Armenia. Down some more steps to the lowest point in the whole church is the chapel of the Finding of the Cross, where Helena is believed to have found and identified the true cross. This is a statue of Helena holding the cross. On the way out, there is a small area called the Chapel of Adam, where it is believed the bones of Adam were buried. Behind the window there is a crack in the rock, which is supposed to have been caused by the earthquake at the time that Jesus died. Matthew 27 verse 51. This spot is directly beneath the Chapel of Calvary upstairs, and it is believed that the blood of Jesus trickled down through the rock to Adam's skull. So we're now back out on the street. Modern Jerusalem is divided into 4 quarters: Christian, Muslim, Armenian and Jewish. And we're now in the Jewish quarter. Lots of shops here, and in the middle of the street there is an excavated shaft showing the remains of the city wall at the time of the first temple. Outside this is a covered excavation of the ancient broad wall built by King Hezekiah in around 700 BC to defend against the Assyrians. 2 Chronicles 32. Also in Isaiah 22 verse 10 it says that houses were broken down and used to build the wall. This is a synagogue on the way back to the Western Wall. It was Friday afternoon while we were here, and the streets were becoming quieter as people prepared for the Sabbath, which begins at sunset. This is the Western Wall Plaza. The wall is about 20 meters high, though there is another 12 meters below the current street level. Street level at the time of the Second Temple would be around 9 meters below where it is at the moment. The stone arch, almost in the center of the picture, supports a large bridge connecting the Temple Mount with the ancient city. Further north and underground, there is a stone in the wall that is 13 meters long and weighs over 500 tons. The plaza is officially an open-air synagogue, and to appease the more Orthodox Jews, men and women pray in separate areas. The women's section is on the right. Day 7 is our last full day, where we travel southeast to the ancient rock fortress of Masada. This is an elevated railway on the edge of Jerusalem. And again, a section of the security barrier around most of Jerusalem. On the main road towards Jericho, we saw a signpost pointing to the Museum of the Good Samaritan. We didn't stop there, we just passed by. Some camels. Also on our way to Masada, we passed a place called En Gedi. This is an oasis in the desert and has palm trees, streams, botanical gardens and so on. In the Bible, this is the place where David hid from Saul, as in 1 Samuel chapter 24. The vineyards here are also mentioned in Song of Solomon chapter 1. So this is the mountain fortress of Masada. It's about 350 meters high, and there is an 18-acre plateau on top. It was captured by King Herod in 43 BC, and he built 2 palaces on it. He was able to get water up there, enough for bathhouses, swimming pools, and also for crop irrigation. He had huge storerooms and cisterns where he could store food and water. In 66 AD, Jewish rebels took over the fortress, and after Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, this was the last stronghold of the Jews against the Roman Empire. But the Romans came here and laid siege to the fortress for several months. Eventually, they built a tower on a ramp to try to break the fortress's wall. When it became clear that the Romans were going to break through the wall, the 960 people of Masada took their own lives rather than live as Roman slaves. So there are 2 ways to get to the top. One is the path, which is not recommended in the 34-degree heat. We took the cable car. This is a view back down, and you can see the Dead Sea in the distance. You can also see some people did actually use the path. This is the cable car station near the top. And another photo of the desert. The small square on the right of the picture is one of the 8 Roman forts that were built around the mountain during the siege. This is a model of Herod's northern palace on 3 levels. And this is looking down on the middle tier of the palace. Some people here making their way down to see the lower tiers. These are some of the walls and remains of the buildings. The rectangular buildings on the left are the storage rooms and could hold enough supplies to keep thousands of people for years. And this is the ramp the Romans built to gain access to the defensive walls of the fortress. Hold on tight.
Enjoy your visit to the Southern National Park. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Back in the visitor center, a quote from Joshua 1 verses 2 to 4. So we head back north again, a couple of photos taken out of the window of the coach. A lot of stones to be gathered there. Next stop is Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found by a Bedouin shepherd in 1946. They spent the next 10 years searching and excavating for further scrolls in this part of the desert. Yeah, we had lunch here, but very busy, very touristy. Our final destination on the tour was a visit to the Dead Sea. It says beach on the photo, but it's not like a beach at all, unless you substitute sand for mud. So we stopped at the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. The land opposite, on the top right, is the country of Jordan. The Dead Sea is the lowest place on Earth, at over 400 meters below sea level, and it's getting lower by almost a meter every year. There's no exit river, so the water is lost due to evaporation. It's very salty, very easy to float, but not so nice if you happen to get a splash of water in the eye. So from there we made our way back to Jerusalem. Sunset on Saturday means the end of the Sabbath. The following day was the end of our trip to Israel, and we departed for Tel Aviv airport and our journey home.